Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Vishal Gyawali from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, and it's my big pleasure and honor to be with you today for this Choosing Wisely India meeting. And I'm especially thankful to Dr. Shiroi and the organizers for having the title of this meeting as Choosing Wisely / Avoiding Wisely, because I have been talking about avoiding wisely for a long time. I personally believe that when you say choosing wisely, you always have that unconscious bias to choose something, to do something, but avoiding wisely means you are making a conscious decision to avoid things that are not in the best interest of the patients. So I'm very happy that the official title of this meeting is includes avoiding wisely as well. And accordingly, the topic of my talk is avoiding clinical trials wisely. So I'll be discussing about what type of clinical trials should be a priority for low and middle income countries. Because when we talk about choosing wisely or avoiding wisely, we are usually talking about interventions in medicine, but clinical trials are also the most important intervention that is available for the patients. And having an appropriate trial will lead to change in medical practice. So we need to talk about this avoiding wisely philosophy in terms of clinical trials as well, and that's what I'm going to do today. These are my conflicts of interest. So we all know that the burden of cancer is growing every day, every year in low and middle income countries. There is no question about it. But the problem is how we are treating cancer in low and middle income countries. Is it based on evidence that we have from LMICs? And the answer is no. We are treating patients in LMICs based on the evidence that primarily comes from high income countries, as you can see in this paper. And the gap between the outcomes for the same cancer among the high income countries and among low income countries is staggering. There is a huge gap. So there is no question about disparities as well. But one of the important interventions is clinical trials. That's how science moves forward, and that's how we can treat our patients well. But if we look at the clinical trials that are being conducted across the world, we see that despite LMICs having a huge burden of certain cancers, the number of clinical trials that is being conducted in these countries is quite low, disproportionately low, embarrassingly low. So there is a big mismatch between the amount of trials being conducted versus the cancer burden in the country. So no doubt, LMICs should start focusing on clinical trials because it leads to equity in access to clinical trials. It will also lead to capacity building, training opportunity, collaboration, access to novel drugs, and there might be some niche population that is specific to certain LMICs. And without doing trials in those populations, we'll never have an answer to what is the best treatment for this group of patients. So there might be different needs, different priorities, and also clinical trials can help address financial toxicity by testing cheaper interventions. So the question is not whether LMICs can afford to do clinical trials. LMICs, in fact, cannot afford to not make cancer control or clinical trials their priority agenda. And effective policy is, of course, data-driven policy, and that data comes through research and trials. So that should be a priority. But the problem is all trials are not created equal. So that's where choosing trials wisely or even avoiding trials wisely comes into place. So we had written this paper in Nature Cancer in 2020 about the challenges and opportunities for cancer clinical trials in LMICs. And we discussed this concept in detail there as well, but the bottom line is we need to be very selective in what type of clinical trials we have to prioritize for LMICs. Obviously, participating in big industry-sponsored multinational clinical trials that are not relevant to the local population should not be a priority. And in fact, that's what called research parachute or even research parasite, because there are certain trials that are conducted in LMIC population just to get the drug approved back in high income countries, and patients in LMICs will never have access to that drug again. One good example is the cemiplimab trial in first line patients with non-small cell lung cancer, PD-L1, 50% or higher. This was conducted in several LMICs. But before this trial, we already knew that pembrolizumab was the standard of care for this group of patients. And as you can see the date, in 2016, we knew that pembrolizumab significantly improve survival for this group of patients. In 2016 November, this was already published in New England Journal paper, and pembrolizumab had already received FDA approval, and pembrolizumab was the standard of care for this group of patients. But in between June 2017 and 2020, the cemiplimab trial recruited patients from several LMICs to receive cemiplimab or chemotherapy. So this is a chemotherapy control arm. In 2017 and especially in 2020, no patient with a PD-L1 50% or higher non-small cell lung cancer would get chemotherapy. They would get pembrolizumab, but they used an inferior control arm. And because it would have been unethical to run in US and Canada, they ran in several LMICs and got the drug approved in the US FDA. So this is unethical and this is troublesome. But some people argue that at least by being a part of this trial, some patients in these LMICs had access to cemiplimab and immunotherapy. But the question is, can access to the new drug in LMICs justify conducting a trial that would not have been ethical in high-income countries? And the Helsinki Declaration is clear about this. The Helsinki Declaration says you have to use the best standard of care as the control arm and not the local standard of care. But the problem is there is no guarantee for continued access. All those countries that participated in this trial, patients in those countries will not have access to this drug after the trial is complete. There are so many patients and they will have to pay a huge amount of money, or the drug might not even be approved in those countries where this trial was conducted. And this question was in fact very nicely answered in one of recent JAMA open papers, in which they looked at the FDA approved drugs that were trialed in several LMICs in several countries outside of the US, plus in the US as well. And they found that within 1 year, only 13% of high-income countries had access to this drug, but there were 0% of low and middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries who had access to this drug. Within 5 years, that percentage raised a little, but still less than a quarter of these LMICs that participated in those trials had access to these drugs. This shows the same thing, and if you look at like countries in Africa, the number of drugs that they had access to despite participating in those trials, 5 years after FDA approval is still at 0%. And it's only slightly improved for other LMICs. What about early phase, like phase 1 clinical trials? Sometimes we see phase 1 clinical trial, LMICs getting involved in those trials. But we have to see that only 3.4% of cancer drugs that go through phase 1 are ultimately approved. And the probability of success is much higher at phase 3. So I think participating in phase 3 should be a priority for LMICs instead of participating in phase 1 or phase 2. However, if there are certain novel molecules that are specific to the local context, or if we are trying to estimate the safety of a novel approach that would not have been trialed elsewhere, then in that situation, LMICs might consider doing phase 1 trials as well. As you can see, that the number of phase 1 trials in LMICs is not that big, but it has been growing recently. But I think the focus should be on conducting phase 3 randomized trials for us. And especially when we are conducting these new molecule trials, we should try to differentiate between what is a real innovation and what is a pseudo innovation, because we see so many pseudo innovation type new molecules coming up. We had this paper in Nature Reviews comparing regorafenib with sorafenib, and if you look at the molecular structure, you can't even say that they are two different molecules. It's so closely resembling to each other, except for this fluoride atom here. So this should not be our focus. We should be focusing on novel approaches that are relevant in our context. So basically, this is the philosophy of Cancer Groundset as well, to ensure that patients will have access to cancer treatment all over the world, irrespective of where they live or how much income they have. So the bottom line is LMICs should not make the mistake of copy pasting high income countries, and we should focus on our priorities and our type of trials. So what are our priorities in terms of trials? Those trials should address a question of important need in the society. The unmet clinical needs should be backed by good evidence. They should assess interventions that would be cost effective and straightforward to apply if found to be efficacious. And this should be easy to conduct within the routine practice. So where do we start? What are the priorities in terms of clinical trials for LMICs? Uh, this is an important paper that I would recommend people to read, and they discuss about various successes and challenges for different trials in LMICs, and they identify that hypofractionation, palliative care, and alternate treatment combinations are a high priority initiative for helping capacity building in LMICs. To give some other examples, specific examples, for example, this was a trial of toripalimab plus chemotherapy in nasopharyngeal carcinoma, the Jupiter-02 trial, which was presented at ASCO plenary this year. Now, this is an immunotherapy trial, but this, I think, is a very important trial because this was a trial that was conducted in China. And nasopharyngeal carcinoma is a big disease burden in China. Outside of, compared to the disease burden outside of East Asia, the disease burden is huge in China and surrounding countries. So they have to do a trial there. And toripalimab is a new checkpoint inhibitor. So in this case, even a Me Too drug trial is an important intervention because this is a locally developed checkpoint inhibitor, and that will help to address the disease burden in the local context. And it's not going to be so expensive for Chinese patients because it's a locally developed product. Other example, we published this in seminars of oncology earlier this year. When China developed a local EGFR TKI called icotinib, then it also, and it was priced low, and that price competition also reduced the price of erlotinib and gefitinib, the other two established EGFR TKIs. So in that sense, if you have a locally developed Me Too product, then doing a trial of that product makes sense. And the other important type of trials that have been done in LMICs that fulfill all those criteria that I discussed earlier, for example, using gefitinib plus chemotherapy in EGFR mutated lung cancer. This came from Tata. And usually osimertinib is considered to be the standard of care, but this approach combining gefitinib plus chemo will probably provide similar benefits but at a cheaper cost. And again, the other question in oral cancer, node-negative oral cancer, was when to do neck dissection, elective versus therapeutic. That question was answered from this very pragmatic trial. Also, this research was about metronomic capecitabine in nasopharyngeal carcinoma as adjuvant treatment. This is also easily applicable. And the trial of arsenic in hepatocellular cancer, aspirin trials, progesterone trials in breast cancer, the role of surgery in breast cancer, the nanoparticle paclitaxel instead of Abraxane, which is expensive, and the aspirin trials, as I mentioned. So these are the examples of some pragmatic brownshot type trials that should be our priority in LMICs. But to give a good summary, if we think in terms of COVID, then we need to focus on dexamethasone type trials rather than remdesivir type trials. Remdesivir mortality benefit was marginal, very expensive. Dexamethasone mortality benefit substantial, but very cheap and affordable across the world. In that Nature paper, we discuss about several areas of focus for LMICs in high-income countries for clinical trials and how we can collaborate, how we can work together. Because Outback trial, again, an ASCO plenary earlier this year for cervical cancer is a good example of how high-income countries research can help low and middle-income countries as well, because cervical cancer is a big burden in high-income countries. But this trial was conducted mostly in high-income countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, and Canada. There is also a question why this trial was not conducted in low and middle-income countries, and they justify that in one of their papers, saying huge bureaucracy. And the beauty of social media was I, in fact, got a response from the first author of Outback trial about why it was not conducted in low and middle income countries, and she had kindly replied that although the trials seem to be cheaper in LMICs, the clinical trial insurance rules and other bureaucratic process made it much difficult to set up trial at that time point. So the take-home message at the bottom line is we should not think about whether or not LMICs do trials. LMICs should do trials. The question is not whether we should do it or not. The question is how to do it right and what are the appropriate type of trials and what investment is required. And is that trial a priority in local setting? There is no point, I think, in LMIC doing a phase 1 trial of a cancer drug whose phase 3 will be run elsewhere, approved elsewhere, and will be unaffordable. There is not a priority for LMICs even to participate in big phase 3 trials, multinational trials, of an expensive drug that will not be affordable in the country later on, and there will not be access for the patients. We should think, will the resources be better spent elsewhere? And trials for the sake of doing trials should be avoided. We need to do trials for the sake of answering questions for our patients. And the spirit of choosing wisely, we should extend to clinical trials as well. So we need to move from choosing wisely to avoiding wisely. We need to be very vigilant about what are the clinical trials that we should in fact avoid because they are not in patients' best interest. Thank you very much.